In the scorching wastelands of ancient Mesopotamia, where the sun itself seemed to conspire with death, one of Rome's most powerful men met an end so grotesque, so terrifying, that it echoed like a curse through the empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, had spent his life piling wealth upon wealth, building his fortune on blood, ash, and suffering. He believed gold could buy him anything: power, respect, even immortality. But gold, when worshipped as a god, has a way of turning against its worshippers. This is the tale of how greed itself became Crassus's executioner. The year was 53 BCE. Rome's hunger for conquest was insatiable. Its appetite stretched across continents like a beast that could never be fed. Three men ruled this fractured, blood-drenched world: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. Together they were the triumvirate, three titans whose shadows darkened every corner of the empire. Yet while Caesar's name thundered with victories in Gaul, and Pompey was praised as the master of the seas, Crassus bore a humiliating truth. He was seen not as a warrior, not as a hero, but merely a banker in the company of conquerors, a merchant of lives, a man of coin. This was normal in Rome. Gold spoke louder than blood. Gold could silence enemies, purchase armies, and manipulate laws. But for Crassus, gold was never enough. He yearned for the one thing money could not buy: glory. He had wealth greater than kings, but without the respect of Rome's legions, he was nothing more than a shadow behind giants. He had watched powerless as Caesar carved his empire from the tribes of Gaul. He had watched Pompey's name rise like a god as he swept the Mediterranean clean of pirates. Their victories echoed through marble halls, sung by poets and etched into monuments. And Crassus, his legacy was counted in ledgers, whispered in back rooms, measured not in blood spilled, but in coins exchanged. He was the third wheel of the triumvirate, an insult that gnawed at him like a disease. At 60 years old, when most men would sink into their riches and bask in luxury, Crassus chose another path. He could not die a banker. He would carve his name into history with conquest or be buried beneath the sand trying. And so his eyes turned eastward, beyond the Euphrates toward the Parthian Empire. Parthia, a land stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus, glittering with silk, dripping with spices, pulsing with trade. To Crassus, it was more than a kingdom. It was a golden prize, a siren song calling him to both unimaginable riches and the military triumph that would finally silence his mockers. If he could conquer Parthia, his fortune would dwarf even his own, and his name would be carved in stone beside Caesar and Pompey. Not as a banker, but as a god of war. But Rome was not blind to his ambition. The Senate, suspicious of his hunger, refused to grant him the traditional declaration of war. They saw through him, saw the greed dripping from his every word. Yet Crassus pressed forward, blinded by desire. This was normal for him, ignoring reason, deaf to warnings. Greed does not negotiate. Greed only devours. In 55 BCE, Crassus arrived in Syria as governor. He wasted no time. He began preparing his grand invasion, dismissing every warning that dared reach his ears. Local commanders who knew the Parthians, who whispered of their devastating cavalry and their mastery of the desert, were mocked as cowards. The desert has always bent to Rome, he told himself. Why would this be any different? And yet, this could happen to you. The confidence that blinds, the arrogance that deafens. You believe yourself untouchable, and in that belief, you walk willingly into the arms of ruin. Intelligence reached him, whispers of strife within the Parthian court, rumors of weakness, of a distracted king. It was all he needed. To Crassus, this was proof that the gods themselves had chosen him. He raised one of the greatest armies Rome had ever sent eastward. 7 legions, nearly 40,000 men. To this he added 4,000 cavalry, 4,000 light infantry, an army so vast it swallowed the horizon. Among his officers marched his son, Publius, a warrior of proven valor, a man who had fought under Caesar in Gaul. To Crassus, his son was more than blood. He was the promise of a dynasty. Together they would claim glory eternal. In the spring of 53 BCE, Crassus led his massive host across the Euphrates at Zeugma. The invasion had begun. At first, the omens seemed to favor him. Towns fell with ease. Villages surrendered without a fight. Roman siegecraft crushed resistance before it could rise. The vast flatlands of Mesopotamia stretched before him like an open grave, and he mistook it for an open road. What he did not see, what he refused to see, was the trap slowly closing around him. At first, fortune seemed to smile upon him. Crassus believed the gods had bent the desert itself to his will. Local settlements crumbled before Roman siegecraft, their gates forced open, their people bowing without resistance. Some villages surrendered before the first blow was struck, eager to throw themselves at the feet of Rome. To Crassus, this was proof of destiny, proof proof that the East would fall as easily as the West had. This was normal. Rome advanced, and the world surrendered. This was the pattern, carved in blood for centuries. And yet, what if the pattern broke? What if the desert was not a road to glory, but a tomb? The Mesopotamian plains stretched endlessly, flat and barren, their silence heavy with secrets. Crassus mistook this silence for weakness. Reports whispered that King Orodes of Parthia was consumed by rebellion within his court, too distracted to guard the frontier. To Crassus, it was the sign of weakness he had been waiting for. He saw only what he wanted to see, but what he wanted was the very thing that would damn him. For in truth, the Parthians were watching, always watching. Their young commander, Surena, did not fight as Crassus expected. He was no barbarian chief to be crushed beneath Roman discipline. He was the desert itself, patient, cunning, merciless. Surena did not meet the Romans head-on. No grand battle, no glorious clash of armies. Instead, he allowed them to march. He allowed them to sweat beneath the pitiless sun, their throats cracking, their skin blistering, their armor burning to the touch. He lured them deeper and deeper, farther from water, farther from safety, farther from Rome. Every step forward was a step into the jaws of a beast they could not see. This was normal for the Parthians. To them, the desert was not an enemy, it was a weapon, and they wielded it with precision. The few skirmishes that erupted were not battles at all, but cruel illusions. Parthian riders would appear at the horizon, archers glinting in the sun, and the Romans would ready themselves for the clash. But before steel could meet steel, the riders vanished, fading into the dunes like phantoms. Hours later, they would appear again at a different ridge, watching, waiting, taunting. The soldiers grew restless. Sleep abandoned them. At night, strange sounds echoed across the sands, hooves in the distance, whispers in the dark. Watchmen swore they saw movement, shadows slipping between dunes, yet no enemy could be caught. It was as if the desert itself had come alive to torment them. The men's nerves frayed, their discipline thinning like parchment in fire, and always the arrows, invisible, sudden, merciless. Supply lines were ambushed without warning, the attackers striking like wraiths and disappearing before a sword could be raised. Convoys burned, messengers vanished, horses returned riderless, their bodies pierced with shafts. The Romans marched, but they marched blind, never knowing where the next attack would fall. This could happen to you. Imagine it. You walk forward, confident, certain of your path, and yet unseen hands pull you deeper, closer to the point of no return. You feel the trap tightening, but still you tell yourself, I will prevail. That is how ruin begins. Crassus began to understand too late that the tactics of Rome were powerless here. His legions were heavy, their armor suffocating, their formations built for forests and fields, not the shifting sands of Mesopotamia. Rome's strength was discipline, the grinding press of steel and shield, but against shadows and phantoms. What is discipline worth? The cavalry he brought was too few, too clumsy. They could not match the Parthian riders who seemed to float across the desert, loosing arrows from impossible distances, striking with cruel precision, then vanishing into the horizon. His soldiers sweated, bled, and died under a sun that offered no mercy. The desert that had once seemed like an open road now felt like a trap with walls closing in from every side. At last, the army stumbled toward the city of Carrhae, where Crassus believed he could make his stand. The land itself seemed to offer hope. Low hills would shield his infantry, a nearby water source promised relief, and rumors whispered that Surena's full force was finally approaching. At last, a decisive battle, one great clash that would restore honor and silence the doubts. Crassus convinced himself that the gods would not abandon him now. He believed this would be his vindication. But in truth, he was walking into the moment that would destroy everything. His army, his son, his name, and his soul. The trap was complete. The Parthians were waiting. The dawn of June 9th, 53 BCE, rose heavy and suffocating over Carrhae. The Romans assembled in their time-tested formation, believing tradition itself could protect them. The heavy infantry stood in the center, shields gleaming, faces hardened by discipline. Cavalry guarded the wings. Light troops spread thinly across the front. To an untrained eye, it looked magnificent. Standards raised against the sky, the might of Rome itself stretching across the barren plain. This was normal. Rome had conquered the world with formations like this. When the legions locked shields, when the discipline held, the outcome was always the same: victory, glory, domination. But here, in the merciless desert, tradition would become a coffin. Crassus stood with the center, clinging to the illusion of control. His son Publius, full of youthful fire, commanded the right-wing cavalry. Father and son, 2 generations bound together by ambition, convinced that this day would crown them with eternal honor. Then the desert stirred. Surena's army appeared, not as Rome expected, Not a disciplined line of infantry and siege engines, but a storm of hooves and steel. A cavalry force unlike anything the Romans had ever faced. Thousands of horse archers, their movements fluid as water, circled like vultures. In their midst, the heavy cataphracts, cavalry armored in scales of gleaming metal from head to toe, stood like iron statues, immovable, waiting for their moment. The Romans braced for the charge. They expected the clash of steel, the collision of cavalry against shield, but no charge came. Instead, the sky darkened. A sound like the hiss of serpents rose above the battlefield. Arrows, tens of thousands of arrows. The first storm struck like rain made of death. Shafts pierced shields, armor, flesh. Men screamed. Horses reared and collapsed. Yet the Romans tightened their formation, raising shields overhead in the testudo, the tortoise. They believed they could endure. This was normal. Enemy archers always ran dry eventually. Always. But the Parthians did not run dry. Behind their archers rode supply trains carrying endless quivers. The sky darkened again and again. Arrows rained for hours without mercy. Shields splintered. Flesh tore. Morale bled away like water in the sand. The Romans had no answer. They could not charge what they could not catch. They could not shield themselves from a sky that never emptied. Slowly, inevitably, their discipline began to crack. And then, the fatal moment. Publius, eager to prove himself, eager to silence the whispers that he was merely his father's son, led his cavalry in a charge. His men thundered forward, lances aimed at the cataphracts in the Parthian center. Surena had been waiting. The cataphracts absorbed the charge with brutal calm, their armor shrugging off the impact. From all sides, the horse archers closed in, circling, loosing shafts into the trapped cavalry. Publius's men fell in heaps, pierced, bleeding, screaming beneath the desert sun. The Roman cavalry found itself surrounded, cut off from the main force, swallowed by the Parthian tide. Crassus watched helplessly from the distance as his son's force was shredded before his very eyes. He shouted, ordered, pleaded, but the desert devoured his words. The slaughter was merciless, calculated. And then came the horror. Surena's men severed Publius's head and mounted it on a spear. They raised it high above their ranks, parading it where the Romans could see. The sunlight glinted off his lifeless eyes, his mouth frozen in silence. Imagine it. Your child's head lifted before you, not in triumph but in mockery. This could happen to you. This was not battle anymore. This was torment designed for the soul. The sight shattered Crassus. The proud general who had crossed the Euphrates with dreams of glory now stood hollow, broken, barely able to command. His men looked at him and saw not a leader but a husk. Roman discipline dissolved. They were no longer an army but prey. The arrows rained without end, tearing holes in their once proud formation. The sun baked them. The sand burned beneath their feet. The air itself seemed to suffocate them. The Parthians struck and vanished, until the Romans no longer knew where safety lay. Water ran low, corpses piled high. Wounded men cried for mercy that never came. The desert that had once seemed like an open path now closed around them like a tomb. Night fell, but the nightmare did not end. Crassus attempted to lead his men in retreat toward Carrhae, hoping the walls of a city might shield them from cavalry. But the retreat dissolved into chaos. Exhausted men abandoned shields, weapons, even comrades. Some collapsed where they stood, swallowed by sand. Others were cut down in the dark by enemies they could not see. By dawn, what had once been Rome's greatest eastern army was reduced to a shattered mob. Half their strength was gone. Their standards were lost. Their spirit was broken. And Crassus, once the richest man in Rome, was now nothing more than a grieving father, a desperate man, a general trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The battle he had longed for had come, but it had not brought him glory. It had brought him ruin. The desert had devoured them. The legions that once marched like iron machines now crawled toward Carrhae like the wounded, the broken, the damned. Thousands had fallen in the night. Standards were gone, trampled into the sand. Armor was abandoned. Shields were cast aside by trembling hands that could no longer carry the weight. By dawn, the survivors stumbled through the gates of Carrhae, half men, half ghost. This was normal in defeat. Armies retreat, leaders rally, and battles resume another day. But this was not a simple defeat. This was annihilation creeping forward, inevitable, merciless. This was not survival. it was prolonging the agony. Crassus had lost more than soldiers. He had lost the spirit of Rome itself. His men no longer looked to him as a commander. They saw only an old man hollowed by grief, a father who had watched his son die and could no longer raise his voice without it cracking. The proud general who had promised them glory now stood shrunken, his words brittle, his face ash-pale beneath the desert sun. Still, desperation clung to him. He whispered of regrouping, of retreating further, of finding salvation beyond this city. Yet even as he spoke, the truth choked him. There was no salvation. The desert was closed, the Parthians were everywhere. And then, as if to mock their despair, Cyrene extended an offer. Envoys rode under white flags, their banners rippling in the hot wind. They spoke of mercy, they spoke of terms, they promised negotiations, a withdrawal, perhaps even safe passage home. To men who had seen nothing but arrows, thirst, and death, the offer glittered like water to the dying. Some Roman officers urged caution. They smelled treachery. The Parthians are playing with us, they warned. No mercy waits in their hands. But Crassus, broken, desperate, clinging to the last thread of hope, chose to believe. He needed to believe. If not for himself, then for what remained of his army. This could happen to you. You reach for hope, even when you know it's a lie. You take the outstretched hand, even when it drips with poison, because sometimes the lie is easier to embrace than the truth. A meeting was arranged. Neutral ground between the two armies. Both commanders would come with small entourages. Cyrene arrived in full majesty, his Parthian retinue glittering with armor and banners, their horses stamping the earth like thunder. Crassus came too, his face set in a mask of dignity that fooled no one. His soldiers watched him ride out, their eyes filled not with faith, but with fear. What happened next was chaos wrapped in betrayal. Ancient voices disagree. Some say treachery was planned from the start. Others claim suspicion and confusion lit the spark, but the result was the same. The parley turned violent. Blades flashed, shouts tore the desert air. In the struggle, Crassus was seized, dragged from his horse, forced to the ground. Rome's richest man was now Rome's most helpless prisoner. Cyrene had him bound, his dignity stripped, his power shattered. No ransom was demanded, no honorable execution offered. Crassus was not to die as a general, he was to die as a symbol, because this was not about war anymore. This was about humiliation. The Parthians remembered what Crassus represented: greed, arrogance, and the hunger for gold that had driven him to invade without cause. His war had not been about Rome's destiny, it had been about himself, his craving to outshine Caesar and Pompey. And for that, his death would not be quick. It would not be clean. It would be crafted, deliberate, and unforgettable. The desert was silent now, as if it too waited to see what fate would be carved into the body of the man who had thought himself invincible. This was normal in Rome, ambition unchecked, greed unchallenged, leaders swallowing entire nations in their hunger for glory. But here, in the heart of Mesopotamia, Crassus learned what happens when the tables turn. When the hunter becomes the prey, when the richest man in the world discovers that wealth cannot buy back his son, his army, or his life. He had walked willingly into the jaws of the beast, and now the beast would make him an example. The decision was made. Marcus Crassus would not die like a soldier. He would not be granted the swift mercy of a sword. No, his death would be a spectacle, a message, a punishment carved into eternity. For Cyrene and the Parthians, Crassus was more than a defeated general. He was the embodiment of everything they despised about Rome: arrogance, cruelty, and a greed that devoured without end. His invasion had been unprovoked, driven not by Rome's survival, but by his hunger for gold. And so the very thing he worshipped would become the tool of his destruction. This was normal for Crassus. All his life he had believed gold could buy him anything: power, armies, respect, even history itself. But now gold would show him its true face. Parthian craftsmen prepared the instrument of his punishment. Gold was heated until it lost its beauty, until it seethed and roared like liquid fire. In the crucible, the precious metal transformed into a weapon, shining, blinding, deadly. What Crassus had worshipped now hissed like molten death, waiting for him. And when the time came, they made certain he would not face it in silence. An audience gathered. Parthian nobles assembled, their eyes sharp, their voices hushed. Captured Roman soldiers were dragged forward too, forced to watch what would happen to the man they had once followed across the Euphrates. This was no private execution. It was theater. It was prophecy. It was punishment turned into performance. Crassus was dragged to his knees, his arms pinned, his mouth forced open by iron hands. He tried to speak, but no words came. The desert winds carried only the sound of his broken breath. And then, the gold, molten, glowing, unstoppable. It shimmered as it was lifted. It burned with the heat of 1,000 suns. And drop by drop, inch by inch, it was poured into his mouth. Imagine it. Imagine liquid fire scalding your tongue, rushing down your throat, searing your insides while you remain alive, conscious, screaming without a sound. This could happen to you. The pain was unspeakable. His body convulsed. His eyes bulged. His veins burned as the molten metal carved its way down. The gold did not stop. It filled his mouth, his throat, his lungs. The organ that once shouted for conquest. The tongue that once promised glory. The lips that once commanded men to march into hell. Now melted, blistered, silenced forever. The richest man in Rome, who had believed himself untouchable, was turned into a grotesque parody of his own greed. The gold that had once been his god was now his executioner. The Parthians made certain the message was clear. For Crassus there would be no noble death, no martyrdom, no honor. His end was humiliation itself. He had sought immortality through conquest, but instead his name would be remembered as the man who choked on the very thing he worshipped. And the Romans who watched, their horror was the true victory. They saw their commander reduced to a husk, destroyed not by sword or spear, but by gold. Their terror became the story that would travel back to Rome like a poisoned whisper. This was not war anymore. This was justice. This was vengeance. This was the desert itself, answering the arrogance of Rome. When it was done, when his body had gone still, the molten gold cooled inside him, a grotesque tomb sealed within flesh. He was no longer a man. He was a warning. The crowd did not cheer. They did not roar. They only stared wide-eyed as if they had witnessed the gods themselves punish a mortal. And in a way they had. This was normal in Rome, men consumed by their own ambition. But this time, the punishment had been literal. The very thing Crassus craved became the thing that destroyed him. The golden throat of Marcus Crassus became a legend, a whisper passed through centuries, a reminder that greed, unchecked, does not grant immortality. It carves a path straight into damnation. News travels faster than armies. And so, long before the dust of Carrhae settled, long before the desert had cooled the molten gold in Crassus's body, word of his fate raced across the world. When it reached Rome, it was like a knife across the throat of the Republic. Whispers spread through the streets, echoing in temples and markets. Crassus is dead. The richest man in Rome is gone. But it was not just the death that chilled them. It was the manner of it. The tale of molten gold, of humiliation turned into spectacle, became a poison that seeped into every ear. This was not normal. Rome's leaders did not die like this. Generals might fall in battle, senators might be assassinated, emperors might be poisoned. But molten gold poured down a throat, that was something else. That was not just execution, that was desecration. Panic rippled through the Senate. The illusion of Rome's invincibility, the myth that no foreign hand could truly humble them, was shattered. If the East could burn Rome's greatest army to ashes, if the East could take the wealthiest Roman alive and turn his greed into his death sentence, then who was safe? This could happen to you. One day you are feasting in marble halls wrapped in silk, sipping wine sweeter than honey. The next you are on your knees, choking on the very thing you worshipped. Rome's elites looked into that mirror and saw themselves. The triumvirate, once balanced on three pillars, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, was broken. With Crassus's wealth and ambition obliterated, only two giants remained. But two cannot balance what three once held. Rivalry seeped in like blood through cloth. The absence of Crassus was not emptiness. It was a wound, and from that wound poured civil war. Rome itself trembled. Senators whispered of omens, of curses, of gods who had turned their backs. Ordinary citizens who once believed the legions were unstoppable, now murmured of deserts that swallowed armies whole, of horsemen who struck like ghosts, of enemies who could not be chained by Roman discipline. The people who once walked proudly beneath marble arches now lowered their eyes, haunted by visions of Parthian cruelty. This was normal for empires. Pride builds, pride blinds, pride shatters. Rome was learning the lesson the hard way. And what of Crassus? His death did not fade with the desert winds. It lived on. Every retelling of his molten throat became darker, sharper, more grotesque. Poets twisted it into verse. Philosophers sharpened it into warnings. Historians carved it into stone. They said, "Here lies the richest man in Rome, destroyed by the very thing he loved." They said, "Here is what happens when greed outruns wisdom." They said, "This is what ambition looks like when the gods decide to punish." The horror of it lingered. For men who had once toasted his fortune in golden cups, those cups now burned their lips. For men who had once envied his wealth, that envy now curdled into dread. Gold was no longer just wealth, it was death. This could happen to you. Whatever you love most, whatever you cannot stop chasing, it can become the thing that destroys you. Crassus was proof. He had everything, and still he wanted more. And so he was given more gold than any man could swallow. The Senate tried to bury the panic beneath rituals and prayers. Sacrifices were offered, temples filled with smoke. Priests muttered words of protection. But smoke cannot erase fear. Fear has a way of clinging. Fear has a way of growing teeth in the night. Rome had lost battles before, but this was different. This was humiliation that could not be washed away with blood. This was a wound to pride itself, and pride, once wounded, festers. The Parthians knew this. They had not just destroyed an army, they had destroyed an image. Rome, the eternal conqueror, had been made a victim, and the death of Crassus ensured the scar would never heal. This was not the end of Rome, but it was the beginning of something darker. The Republic was cracking, the balance tipping. And in the shadows, men sharpened their knives, waiting for the moment to strike. The triumvirate was dead the moment molten gold silenced Crassus. What had once been three pillars holding the Republic together was reduced to two, and two can never balance what three once carried. Caesar and Gaul, Pompey and Rome, both had carved their names into history with steel and blood, and now with Crassus gone, nothing stood between them but suspicion, envy, and the inevitable shadow of war. This was normal in Rome. Alliances were never built on trust, only on need, and when the need vanished, alliances rotted into hatred. Crassus had been the glue, his fortune binding Caesar's ambition and Pompey's authority together. Without him, the mask slipped. What remained was rivalry stripped bare, naked and hungry. In the Senate, whispers began to coil like smoke. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, now turned his ear to those who called him Rome's true guardian. They urged him to break Caesar's rise before it devoured everything. And Caesar, across the sea, bathed in victories and drowning in loyalty from his legions. Watch Pompey with suspicion darkening his every thought. This could happen to you. Today you stand shoulder to shoulder with allies, smiling, feasting, swearing oaths. Tomorrow you sharpen knives for the same men you once called brother. This was Rome. This was survival. Crassus's death was more than a loss. It was a curse. The balance had been shattered, and the Republic quivered under the weight of two giants circling each other. Senators prayed for peace, but their prayers dissolved in fear. Citizens spoke of omens, of Rome splitting apart, of gods punishing their greed. And always, always, the story of molten gold echoed as a warning. For Crassus had not only failed himself, he had doomed the Republic. His death tore the mask from Rome's face, revealing the beast beneath. Ambition, always ambition. Caesar's hunger for power was no different from Crassus's. Pompey's pride no different from the greed that had driven an old man into the desert. This was normal. Rome did not run on law or virtue. It ran on the blood of its sons, spilled endlessly for men who wanted more. The people of Rome, once so certain of their empire's destiny, now trembled at what came next. Would Caesar march home with his legions, turning Rome into Gaul conquered anew? Would Pompey crush him with Senate backing and drown the city in its own blood? The death of Crassus whispered the answer. There would be no peace, because greed does not die with one man. It spreads, it consumes, it infects everyone it touches. And Rome, in all its glory, was nothing but greed given flesh. The Senate chambers grew darker, more dangerous. Pompey's voice thundered against Caesar's shadow. Caesar's victories thundered louder than any speech, and in every corner of Rome, men chose sides. Brother turned against brother, friend against friend. This could happen to you. One choice, one step, one allegiance, and suddenly you find yourself on the wrong side of history. Your name erased, your body left on the stones of the Forum. The triumvirate had promised order. It had delivered only ruin. Crassus had sought glory in Parthia and brought back humiliation. His molten throat became a prophecy, a reminder that ambition consumes not only the man who holds it, but the world around him. And so, his death lit the fuse. Caesar and Pompey were the fire waiting to burn. The Republic was the wood piled high, dry, and brittle, and soon flames would consume it all. This was not just politics. This was fate. Rome was collapsing, not from enemies without, but from the greed and hunger of men within. The gods had spoken through molten gold, but Rome had not listened. Rome never listened. Not all Romans died with Crassus. Thousands were taken alive, bound in chains, dragged through the desert like cattle. But survival did not mean salvation. For the Parthians, these men were not soldiers anymore. They were warnings, living, breathing reminders of what happened when Rome dared to stretch its hand too far. This was normal in conquest. Captives enslaved, ransomed, or slaughtered. But the Parthians chose something darker. They scattered them. They uprooted them from the soil of Rome and buried them in foreign lands, so far from home that the Tiber would forever be a ghost in their memory. Some were marched eastward, resettled in distant villages, forced to live among strangers whose tongue they did not understand. There, under foreign skies, they married, worked, and aged, Romans by birth, Parthians by fate. Their children spoke no Latin. Their grandchildren forgot Rome entirely. The legions who had once carried eagles across continents dissolved into dust, absorbed into the very empire they had tried to conquer. Imagine it. You march under the proud banners of Rome, certain your name will be carved into history, and instead you die in obscurity, your bloodline consumed by the very land you sought to conquer. This could happen to you. The Parthians understood cruelty. They knew that killing a man ends his pain, but making him live, stripped of his past, chained to a new identity, that is eternal torment. For the prisoners, the battlefield had ended, but the war inside never ceased. They carried it in their dreams, in their silence, in the foreign faces of children who would never know Rome. This was no act of mercy, it was a strategy, a slow erasure. For years, rumors spread through Rome that survivors of Carrhae still lived, scattered in distant provinces. Whispers of Roman villages far beyond the empire's reach, where men with Latin blood plowed foreign fields under foreign rulers. Rome, proud and eternal, had become a memory in their veins, a memory that faded with every generation. The Parthians made sure their fate contrasted with Crassus's. The soldiers were spared, allowed to live, but only as ghosts of themselves. Crassus, the architect of the disaster, was executed with molten gold, his greed burned into history. His men, by contrast, were denied even the dignity of remembrance. This was normal for empire. Leaders crave glory, soldiers pay the price. One man's arrogance can damn thousands to a fate worse than death. Crassus's hunger had dragged them across the desert, and now their punishment was to vanish, to be erased, to be forgotten. And yet the story of those prisoners haunted Rome almost as much as Crassus's golden death. Senators whispered of them in the dark. Families mourned sons whose bones would never return. Mothers waited for faces that would never again walk through the gates. The idea that Romans lived as strangers in strange lands gnawed at the Republic's pride. Because this could happen to anyone. One campaign, one defeat, and you are not a citizen anymore. You are dust, swallowed by the very world you sought to conquer. The Parthians had crafted something Rome could not undo. They had turned survivors into symbols. Every living Roman prisoner was proof that Rome could bleed, proof that Rome could break. Their lives became scars etched across the empire's reputation, and in the silence of foreign lands, those prisoners themselves must have known the truth. They were not heroes. They were not martyrs. They were shadows of Crassus's greed, condemned to wander a world that no longer called them Roman. This was not mercy. This was obliteration, slow, methodical, haunting, death by forgetting. The molten gold did not end with Crassus's body. It lived on, festering in memory, growing sharper in retelling. Across centuries, poets, historians, and philosophers returned to his fate again and again, using his golden death as a mirror to reflect the darkest truth of ambition. This was normal for storytellers, turning death into lessons, pain into parable. But the story of Crassus was not just history, it was warning. It was nightmare. Plutarch would later write that Crassus's death was the perfect judgment for a man consumed by greed. Gold, the god he worshipped, became the poison that destroyed him. Other voices carried the tale, each one shaping it, bending it, until the image of molten gold poured into a screaming mouth became less fact and more curse. This could happen to you. The thing you crave most, the dream you chase with blind devotion, could become the very thing that kills you. The symbolism was too sharp, too cruel to ever fade. Rome had been humiliated on the battlefield, but it was the execution that burned into eternity. Soldiers die, battles are lost, but molten gold sliding down a man's throat, no empire forgets that. For the Romans it was more than horror, it was a mirror. Every senator with his gilded villa, every patrician drowning in luxury, every man who measured his worth in coins, when they heard the story, they heard their own funeral. The lesson was written in fire. Wealth without restraint leads not to immortality, but to ruin. This was normal in Rome. Rich men clutching more than they needed, dreaming of legacies carved in marble. But Crassus's death turned their pride to ash. The gold they worshipped had become a serpent, coiled and waiting, ready to devour. The story spread beyond Rome, to the Greeks, to the East, to the corners of the world where whispers carried faster than armies. And everywhere it went, the image remained the same. The richest man in the empire choking on molten wealth, silenced by the very god he adored. It became metaphor. It became prophecy. Philosophers pointed to him as proof that excess leads to destruction. Teachers invoked his name as a warning to youth. Orators used his fate to silence the ambitious, to remind them that what glitters can also burn. But beneath the morality, beneath the speeches and the writings, lay something darker. People loved the story because it horrified them. They loved it because it felt like justice. Crassus had lived in greed, and greed had devoured him. His end was not just fitting, it was satisfying. This could happen to you. Imagine it. All your life you hunger, you claw, you climb, you build towers of wealth so high you believe nothing can touch you. And then, in one cruel twist, the thing you built your life upon is shoved down your throat until it kills you. That is not just irony. That is damnation. The molten gold became larger than life. Even those who doubted its literal truth could not deny its symbolic power. Whether it was history or myth no longer mattered. What mattered was the message. Ambition, unchecked, consumes. Greed, unchecked, burns. This was not just about Crassus. It was about Rome itself. His death was a reflection of the Republic's hunger, its endless conquests, its devouring appetite for land, slaves, and treasure. If one man's greed could end in molten gold, what fate awaited an empire built on the same hunger? Hauntingly, the answer was already whispering in the streets of Rome. Civil war was coming. Blood would run through the forum, and just as Crassus's gold had devoured him, Rome's own greed would devour the Republic. The golden throat of Crassus did not stay in Mesopotamia. It echoed in every marble hall, every Senate debate, every whispered conversation. It was a story too dark to forget, too sharp to ignore. Death should have ended Crassus's torment, but the Parthians would not let him rest. Even in death, his humiliation continued, stretched into mockery, twisted into spectacle. This was normal for conquerors, trophies taken, enemies displayed, the fallen mocked to magnify the victor's glory. But what the Parthians did with Crassus's head went beyond cruelty. It was theater. It was ritual. It was desecration turned into art. After the molten gold cooled in his corpse, his severed head was sent east, carried to the court of King Orestes II. It was no mere trophy. It was an object of ridicule, a prop of scorn. For Rome's richest man was not to be remembered as a warrior, not as a leader, but as a fool who died choking on his own greed. The Parthians placed his head into their entertainments. In their theaters where actors performed tragedies of Greek origin, Crassus's head was brought onto the stage. They used it in the performance of the Bacchae by Euripides. The audience laughed as the severed head of a Roman general replaced that of Pentheus, the doomed king torn apart for defying the gods. Imagine it. Your face, your eyes, your very skull, paraded before strangers, not in mourning, not in honor, but in ridicule. This could happen to you. One moment, you are a ruler of men, a master of gold, a commander of legions. The next, your corpse is turned into a puppet, your head into a mask for another man's laughter. The Parthians understood the power of symbols. Killing Crassus had been vengeance. Using his head as a stage prop was psychological warfare. It told Rome, your richest man, your so-called conqueror, is not even worth burial. He is a joke. He is entertainment. He is ours. This was normal in their eyes. To mock an enemy was to break him beyond death. To turn his body into theater was to erase the last shred of dignity. Rome's pride, Rome's invincibility, Rome's image, all of it was reduced to a severed head in a play. And the people cheered. The nobles laughed. The Parthians did not merely defeat Rome. They feasted on its humiliation. They made Crassus into a story, a spectacle, a reminder that Rome's hunger could be mocked as easily as it could be destroyed. The soldiers who had survived and been forced into distant exile must have heard the whispers of this mockery. To know their general's head had been paraded like a mask of comedy, displayed for crowds to jeer at, must have cut deeper than any wound. Their loyalty, their suffering, their dead sons and brothers, all reduced to theater. This could happen to you. Not just death, but erasure. Not just defeat, but ridicule. To be remembered not for your victories, but for your humiliation. To be laughed at when you can no longer defend yourself. The Parthians had achieved what no enemy of Rome had dared before. They turned victory into ongoing mockery, ensuring the wound festered long after the battle. For Rome, this was not just military defeat. It was psychological collapse. And in the marble halls of the Republic, the story spread like a sickness. Senators heard of Crassus's head used in plays. Citizens whispered of his molten throat and mutilated corpse. Every retelling deepened the shame. The Republic was not merely beaten, it was laughed at. This was not the ending Crassus had sought. He had wanted his name carved into eternity as a conqueror. Instead, eternity carved him as a clown. His greed, his arrogance, his hunger, they all ended in mockery. Even death had not saved him. The Parthians had ensured that his legacy was not honor, but ridicule. And ridicule is a poison more lasting than any sword wound. Crassus was no longer the richest man in Rome. He was a joke in a foreign theater. Carrhae did not vanish when the battle ended. The desert kept its secrets, but the ground remembered. The sands buried the screams, the corpses, the broken armor. But time has a way of unearthing what should have stayed hidden. This was normal for battlefields. Bones sink into earth, steel rusts, shields crumble. But Carrhae was different. Carrhae was a graveyard that refused silence. Fragments of Roman armor, twisted and torn, lay scattered like the shattered pride of an empire. Arrowheads, blackened with age, littered the soil like teeth still biting centuries later. Skeletal remains stripped of flesh told stories of men who had marched with certainty and died with despair. The desert had consumed them, yet it could not erase the horror. Archaeologists digging centuries later would find proof of annihilation. The weapons of Rome bent and broken, the bones of legions scattered, the remnants of men who believed themselves invincible. And every shard whispered the same thing. Rome was not eternal. This was normal. Every empire leaves behind bones. But here, the bones told a different tale. Not just defeat, but humiliation. Not just death, but erasure. The manuals of Rome were rewritten because of Carrhae. Strategies adjusted, doctrines changed. Commanders studied the disaster not with pride, but with dread. Rome had learned, too late, that not all enemies fought as they did. Not all battles could be won with discipline and steel. The Parthians had taught them terror. They had shown that an army could be destroyed not in one great clash, but slowly, cruelly, bled dry by ghosts on horseback. Rome had been humbled. This could happen to you. You march forward, certain of your strength, certain of your superiority, and then you find yourself undone by shadows, broken by an enemy you never understood. Carrhae became a wound that never closed. In the Senate, the name itself carried poison. The generals who spoke of conquest in the East hesitated. Politicians who had once demanded glory now muttered of caution. Because the desert had proven itself stronger than pride, and yet the battlefield remained. The desert never forgets. Travelers crossing Mesopotamia whispered of strange winds that carried cries, of dunes that shifted to reveal bones, only to bury them again, as if the earth itself was haunted by the slaughter it had witnessed. This was not superstition. This was memory made flesh. For Rome, the lesson was carved into every arrowhead left behind. Do not underestimate the East. Do not believe wealth and numbers alone can win. Do not think yourself untouchable, but pride is stubborn. Pride forgets. And though Carrhae scarred Rome, though it rewrote its manuals, though it terrified its citizens, it did not stop the hunger. Rome would return to the east again and again, chasing the same ghosts that had destroyed Crassus. Because this was normal. Empires do not learn. Empires repeat. The artifacts of Carrhae, dug from the sands, became silent witnesses. Shields that once gleamed with Roman symbols now lay cracked, mocked by time. Weapons that once promised glory now rusted, useless. Bones that once stood in ranks of thousands now scattered like leaves. Each piece was a reminder. Each fragment carried a message. This could happen to you. Your legacy, your pride, your victories, they can all be reduced to rust and bone. Time will not preserve your glory. Time will expose your failure. Carrhae was not just a battlefield. It was a tombstone, a place where the richest man in Rome, his legions, his dreams, and his arrogance were all buried together. And the desert, cruel and patient, made sure the story never faded. The story of Marcus Crassus did not end in the desert, nor in the theater where his head was mocked. His true legacy was far darker, an echo that carried through centuries, a warning whispered across empires. The richest man in Rome had believed himself untouchable. He had believed that gold could buy respect, that conquest could buy immortality. But in the end, his legacy was not one of glory. It was one of horror. This was normal in Rome. Men rose on ambition, climbed on greed, and fell into ruin. But Crassus's fall was different. It was not a stumble. It was a plunge into the abyss, dragging an entire army and the pride of the Republic down with him. Writers would return to his death again and again. Plutarch spoke of molten gold as judgment. Philosophers called it a mirror of greed. To the common people, it was a story to frighten children, a grotesque tale that made the mighty seem fragile. And to emperors who followed, it was a curse, a reminder that Rome itself could choke on its own hunger. This could happen to you. The very thing you worship, the thing you chase with every breath, can turn to poison in your mouth. Crassus had wanted his name carved into eternity beside Caesar and Pompey. Instead, eternity carved him into a warning. The golden throat, the silenced voice, the man who drowned in his own greed. Rome itself bore the scar. The defeat at Carrhae haunted the Senate, haunted the legions, haunted the empire's dreams of Eastern conquest. For decades, the name of Crassus was not spoken with pride, but with bitterness and dread. He had not only failed himself, he had shaken the very image of Roman power. This was normal. Leaders reach too far, and their fall becomes a lesson for those who follow. But the lesson of Crassus was sharper than most. It was fire. It was gold. It was horror. His molten death became more than history. It became symbol. Greed unchecked will consume you. Ambition without wisdom will destroy you. Wealth without restraint is not power. It is a noose waiting to tighten. And yet the lesson was not truly learned. For Rome continued to hunger, continued to expand, continued to devour. Crassus's death was not enough to kill the disease. It was only a symptom. The Republic itself would choke on its own ambition, just as he had. Civil war, dictatorship, collapse. His golden throat was a prophecy of what Rome itself would become. This could happen to you, not just to generals, not just to empires, but to anyone who cannot stop hungering for more. Enough is never enough. Until one day, the thing you love most opens its jaws and swallows you whole. The molten gold of Marcus Crassus still whispers across time. It whispers in the ears of the ambitious. It hisses in the dreams of the greedy. It stands as a reminder that the gods, or fate, or fortune, or the weight of your own choices, always demand payment. The richest man in Rome thought he could buy glory. Instead, he bought damnation. His end was not simply death, it was transformation. From man to myth. From general to grotesque warning. His golden throat became eternal, a symbol carved into the nightmares of history. And so the story endures. Not because of his wealth, not because of his power, not because of the armies he led or the lands he conquered, but because of how he died. Because this was not just Crassus's fate. This is the fate of all who refuse to see their own hunger for what it is, a fire that cannot be fed. The molten gold poured into his throat still burns, not in his body, long turned to dust, but in the memory of mankind.